There's a famous expression, an idiom, one that dates all the way back to the 1500s, but one we still use today. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And for years, a hardworking and humble housekeeper, she thought she knew her devil, her employer, a very rich, very powerful lawyer who came from a very rich and very powerful Southern family. And she knew her devil. He could be difficult. He could be particular. He was brash, even a bully. But he was the devil she knew, and the one she was loyal to for years. That is until one summer, when she would discover the devil she thought she knew, well, she didn't have a clue of who he really was and the evil deeds he was capable of, until it was too late. This is a story about one of the most famous, most infamous true crime sagas of the 21st century so far. And it's a complicated saga that's been told and retold across podcasts, limited TV series, documentaries, books. It might appear that there is no way to look at the saga of the Murdaugh family, particularly the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, that's the wife and son of Alex Murdaugh, in any enlightening or more edifying way. But in this episode, you'll hear a different take on the saga of the Murdaugh murders from a perspective that was closest to this case, that even helped crack the case, but was overlooked for years. Not one, but two individuals who were pivotal in the outcome of this case, but remained on the periphery of the telling and retelling of the Murdaugh family story for years. Two relative underdogs who would become unlikely heroes. And I look forward to sharing it all with you in tonight's episode of Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator of this podcast, and I've said it before, but I'll say it again. It is a sincere pleasure making this podcast for you. And Dead Sleep, as you know, is proudly independent and ad-free. You can listen to any episode, all the episodes back to back, and you will not encounter a single ad or a single sponsor. And that is by design. It just ruins the show to have that stuff in there for you and for me. This is a show I make for people like me. People who like to fall asleep to true crime and want stories that are engaging and factually accurate, but without all of the gory details, the graphic violence, those horrific 911 calls, and the general hyperbole you tend to get in other true crime shows. If you like to unwind to a good real-life mystery told more mindfully, with lots of extra details and detours to fatigue your overactive mind, then I welcome you to Dead Sleep. And if you like the show and would like to support the show, you can do so via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. It's totally up to you. As of now, you can still enjoy more than 80 episodes for free. Plus, over 20-something episodes that are bonus episodes, along with a whole version of the show that is 100% completely music and sound effects free. It's called Dead Sleep Naked. And if you like that option, where you want no music, no sound effects, if you sign up and subscribe, You get episodes handpicked by me and specifically mixed to be optimized for seamless, perfect, pristine podcast listening. Thank you for indulging me. And once again, if you would like to subscribe, you can do so through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. A free month on Apple Podcasts and a free 7-day trial on Patreon. Please go for it. I want you to be excited to support this show. I'm not here to twist anyone's arm. And if you ever have any issues with your subscriptions, any questions about it, any story ideas, any feedback, you could always reach me directly, Nancy Miller, at deadsleeppodcast@gmail.com. I am a real person. I am not AI. And one of the benefits of being a real person and not AI is that I enjoy hearing from people and I can write you back. deadsleeppodcast@gmail.com. And now this episode, it is about the Murdaugh family murders, specifically covering what happened with Paul and Maggie Murdaugh on a summer night in 2021. But this is, of course, the Dead Sleep version of events, drawn in part from a relatively new memoir that was published in November of 2025 that had details and a point of view that lent unique insight into this story. And it was written by a woman you will hear a lot about tonight. Her name is Blanca Turrubiate Simpson. And I will link to that book along with another book called The Devil at His Elbow, Alex Murdaugh and the Fall of a Southern Dynasty by Wall Street Journal reporter Valerie Berlin. And I'll link to that and the memoir by Blanca in the show notes. Now, of course, as you know, the whole long and complicated and twisty-turny saga of the Murdaugh family and those murders, well, it all takes place in South Carolina. But in this Dead Sleep version of events, our story, it begins somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. A body of water that spans more than 40 million miles, over 100 million kilometers, the second largest body of water on the planet. For many of us, the Atlantic Ocean is difficult to contemplate. It seems vast and dark, salty and mysterious, distant and dangerous. But for a teenage girl called Blanca, the Atlantic Ocean was her escape. From a dismal dead-end future to freedom, adventure, and a new home. It was 1984 when 17-year-old Blanca left her small Texas town for a military career, breaking gender and cultural barriers as a young woman of Mexican heritage to join the U.S. Navy. Blanca, she started at the bottom of the ladder, where the work was the definition of all hands on deck. As an E-2 class seaman, Blanca worked on a naval ship that was known as a floating repair shop, tasked with providing vital maintenance to larger vessels, from destroyers to massive aircraft carriers. Blanca's work, it was grueling, but she embraced the grunt work as she worked her way up, from scraping rust off of massive ships' hulls to eventually learning how to land a helicopter on a flight deck, even steer a ship across the Atlantic. Blanca learned early on how to tackle jobs that were high-level or low-level, tedious or risky. She would take them on with confidence and dignity, a work ethic and sense of duty that would serve her in unexpected ways long after she left the military to get married, settle down, and raise a family with her husband Mark in his home state of South Carolina, an area known as the Low Country. Blanca always saw her work ethic as a good quality. Until one day, her strong work ethic and loyalty would become her greatest weaknesses. Weapons used against her that threatened to destroy her entire life. Geographically, Blanca and her husband Mark, they were both from the South. Mark was from South Carolina and Blanca from South Texas, the furthest point south, a town called Brownsville. Both rural areas with extremes of rich and poor. But right away, Blanca noticed where they were in South Carolina. This particular area, a place called Hampton. Well, it was nothing like where she came from in South Texas. In fact, it was like nowhere she'd ever been in the world. There were two things Blanca noticed almost immediately. Two things she couldn't see, but she could feel. The first was the humidity, the air sticky and stifling. The second was the prejudice. Blanca was of Mexican descent. Her husband Mark was African American. And while it wasn't spoken, not outright, there was a distinct sense of us versus them, the outsiders and the insiders, the high class and the low class. And well, the insiders, they were mostly white, largely wealthy, local families who lived in that part of South Carolina for generations and generations. And without question, the innermost circle of those insiders, the most prominent, dominant, rich white family everyone knew as the Murdaughs. Blanca knew the name, Murdaugh. The name Murdaugh, it's derived from the Scots-Irish, that is, a population of Scottish-Irish immigrants, Protestants from Northern Ireland, who came to this country throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. That name Murdaugh, and you do pronounce that GH like a CK, that name Murdaugh, it means sea warrior. But here, in South Carolina, it was synonymous with law and order, with 4 generations of Murdaugh men serving as the county's lead solicitor. That's essentially the lead district attorney. Not just the town, not just the county, but a large swath of counties all around that area. It wasn't so much of a district as it was a fiefdom since the early 20th century. When the first Murdaugh, that's Randolph Sr. Esquire, began practicing law in Hampton County in 1920. A family legacy like this was impressive to someone like Blanca. Her husband Mark worked in law enforcement, and Blanca, after the Navy, she took a job as a corrections officer, and then as part of a special investigations team at a federal prison facility in South Carolina. Blanca was bilingual, fluent in English and Spanish. She was also perceptive, a good judge of character, and an astute listener. Part of her expertise was in the identification and prevention of gang activity in those federal prisons. But after a while, this work, the constant churn of heinous crimes, remorseless criminals, and a blatant disregard for victims, it wore Blanca down. And eventually, Blanca decided to start a new career, using her bilingual skills as a freelance Spanish-English translator, including helping Spanish-speaking residents with legal documents and court cases. And it was through one of those legal documents and court cases that Blanca first crossed paths with the tallest, loudest, and most outrageous member of the Murdaugh clan, Alex Murdaugh. His name was spelled Alex, though he personally preferred to be called Alec, as a nod to his family's Scots-Irish roots. Blanca, she would come to know him as her future boss. Around the early to mid-2000s, Alex hired Blanca to help him communicate with Spanish-speaking clients in personal injury cases handled by the Murdaugh family law firm. Blanca was immediately impressed by the attention Alex appeared to give these cases, the size of the settlements, and how quickly he came back with those settlements. She appreciated how he worked with people from all walks of life, perceiving his interest in those cases as generous, even altruistic, though she later realized his efforts, like everything he did, was rooted in selfishness and greed. But at the time, she believed she knew Alex Murdaugh, and so when he asked her if she knew of anyone who might be interested in helping his wife Maggie around the house, Blanca thought nothing of offering her services. Why not? She'd help maintain 100,000-ton Navy ships that could hold 5,000 people. She monitored gangs in federal prisons. Helping a family of 4, Alex, his wife Maggie, and their 2 young children, Buster and Paul, that'd be a piece of cake. She could do it. Alex at first told her he wasn't sure it was a good idea. He knew Blanca was overqualified, but she insisted. She believed there was dignity in hard work. It didn't matter what kind. She would help with whatever Ms. Maggie needed. It would just be part-time, which would give Blanca more flexible hours to spend with her own children. Around 2005, Blanca went to work at the Murdaugh's main residence at that time, a classic Southern showplace located in the town of Hampton. Maggie Murdaugh was like the Martha Stewart of the Low Country. She lived to entertain. And at first, Blanca expected the dynamic between the 2 women to be politely professional. But Blanca understood she was the help. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And that was fine with her. She learned how to respect authority and take orders in the military. She also knew how to get along with just about anyone from just about any rank. But much to her surprise, she and Ms. Maggie, they would become fast friends. The woman she assumed was the lawyer's wife, a socialite, the ultimate insider, was, it turned out, a fish out of water herself. The friendship between Maggie and Blanca started the way just about any friendship did in that part of South Carolina. Blanca came with a bag full of biscuits, and Maggie brewed a fresh pot of coffee. In those early morning conversations, Blanca learned that Maggie, she wasn't from South Carolina. She was from North Carolina. And at least in her telling, the Carolinas may be side by side, but they were 2 very different kinds of South. Maggie was from an upper-middle-class family in Wilmington, North Carolina, a cosmopolitan coastal city with a population of roughly 100,000 people. Wilmington was the beachy, breezy, Southern living magazine kind of South. It was also a destination for film production, a cinematic backdrop for dozens of movies, from David Lynch's dark and dreamy Blue Velvet to teen dramas like One Tree Hill. Maggie also spent a good amount of her teen years in Philadelphia. In the late 80s, when Maggie Brandstetter, as she was then, decided to go to college, she attended the University of South Carolina, and it was there she met her future husband, a very tall, very handsome, very red-headed future lawyer named Alex Murdoch. Maggie had a beau at the time, but well, Alex was persistent. He had a way of winning people over, applying just the right amount of charm and pressure. And eventually, he won over Maggie too. The two married in 1993. And part of their shared vision was Alex would work at his family law firm and Maggie would be a full-time wife and mother. And at least from the outside, it sounded ideal. Maggie wanted a life of security, of wealth, comfort. And Alex's family, his life in Hampton County, it guaranteed all three. In 1996, 3 years after they were married, Maggie had Buster, named after one of the most prominent members of the Murdoch family, Alex's grandfather, Randolph II, aka Buster Murdoch. 3 years after that, in 1999, their son Paul was born. Much like Alex, both boys had vibrant, fiery red hair. And much like Alex, they had very strong, intense personalities to match. This was especially true of the youngest, Paul, who was still a young child, 5, 6 years old, when Blanca came to work for the family. But even back then, Maggie joked that Paul was feral. He was hard to control. Maggie and Alex, who were by all accounts pretty laid-back parents, didn't quite know what to do with Paul, how to discipline that kind of child. Though when Blanca spoke with the other housekeeper, the full-time caretaker, her name was Gloria, and she was like family. Gloria said what Paul really needed was more attention, more care, more love. But love in the Murdoch family, it wasn't shown with little hugs and kisses. It was flaunted with big gestures, expensive gifts. With Alex making sure his generosity was out there for the world to see. Because the Murdochs, they were more than a family. They were a dynasty, a ruling clan that exerted control over that part of South Carolina for roughly a century. 4 generations of Murdoch men, who everyone throughout those generations learned to respect, admire, and fear. Maggie loved being part of high society, such as it was in the Low Country, and she reveled in playing hostess with the mostess. But it came with strings attached. Maggie wasn't really appreciated as herself, but as an extension of her powerful husband and her powerful husband's family. And the power and control the Murdoch family exerted over Hampton County and beyond, they also exerted into Maggie's own life. Every holiday, from Thanksgiving to Christmas to the 4th of July, it all happened with the Murdoch side of the family. And if Maggie wanted to celebrate with her side of her family, well, more often than not, she'd have to do that on her own. So Maggie embraced it, she did her best, and she built a little life for herself as a big fish in a small pond. A pond that was wholly owned and controlled by the Murdoch family. What other choice did she have? Without the Murdochs, she had no family, she had no money, she had no home. Without Alex and his family, she didn't belong. Belonging. It was elusive for people like Blanca and even Maggie, because those who belonged in the Low Country, these were families that went back a long way. Their lives, their parents' lives, their grandparents' and great-grandparents' lives intertwined. The Murdoch family had been there for so long. Their power spread so wide. They were as part of the landscape as the kudzu vine, the lush green plant, a legume so synonymous with the South. It's impossible to envision the landscape without it. And it turns out, both the kudzu vine and the Murdochs, well, they took root and took over a certain part of the South at around the same time. The year was 1876, and people from all over the world came to Philadelphia for the first official World's Fair to be held in the United States, which also happened to coincide with the 100th anniversary of our great nation. 1876 was a time of great change and great growth in this country. And there were many fascinating exhibits to enjoy that year that spoke to that growth. But one of the biggest highlights was in horticulture. The concept of something called landscape design was still a novel one. And in Philadelphia that year, there were exotic plants on display from all over the world. Some of them expensive and rare, and impossible to cultivate. But the star of the show that year was one brought from Japan. It was a hardy vine called kudzu. Easy to plant, easy to grow, and the seeds were cheap. In kudzu, it offered people in the South something they desperately needed: relief from the heat. Kudzu, it offered shade. Just a few seeds could be planted along the edge of someone's roof, and kudzu's thick, clinging canopies could provide natural shade in the era before air conditioning, before even fans, before even electricity. What's more, kudzu was promoted throughout the South as a way to prevent soil erosion, and it was therefore enthusiastically introduced all over the region. Once planted, it grew quickly, as promised. And at first, everyone was happy. Then something unexpected happened. The kudzu, it spread out of control, taking over just about everything, choking native plants, devouring fields and farms, and smothering trees until there was nothing but kudzu as far as the eye could see. Kudzu, it was also hard to kill. The only way you could stop kudzu from growing was by going deep into the soil, again and again and again. Stopping kudzu, it's a relentless process. It requires diligence, attention, ripping it out with your bare hands from crown to root. And in the 1920s, as Randolph set up his business, there wasn't much happening in that area, but there was a courthouse. And as a new lawyer, Randolph offered something the people there desperately needed. They needed legal protection from injury, from accidents, from exploitation. And as a personal injury lawyer, Murdoch, he helped people people who were hurt, who got sick, to be fairly compensated for their injuries. Randolph Sr. was the first to go to law school. He was the first to become a local solicitor, a position that would become a tradition within the family. A publicly held position that would be handed down from one Murdaugh to the next, father to son, until Alex, who decided to pass and stick with practicing personal injury law, which by then was far more lucrative, with far less oversight, easier to steal from your clients without getting caught. But even before that, the Murdaugh OG, Randolph Sr., Alex's great-grandfather, he'd already established the family name in that town and set precedent early on that Hampton County was a personal injury paradise. Anyone in the state could come to Hampton for their legal services. And from the 1920s until the 2020s, most of the Murdaugh family business, it was all word of mouth, that they could get you the best settlement, the most money. You didn't need to worry about it. They took care of everything. And the way that the Murdaughs framed it, from one generation to the next, was that they targeted personal injury cases with large companies. And they saw themselves, in part, as Robin Hoods, that they were stealing from the corporate rich and redistributing that wealth to the poor. And at first, it seemed ideal. The Murdaughs were known for fighting for their clients, but over time, whether people realized it or not, this litigious county, a place where so many lawsuits and personal injury cases were filed and often won, many businesses were reluctant to set up shop there. And the unfortunate outcome was the area being deprived of crucial services, from doctors to other businesses. Basically, anyone who did not want to risk getting sued. And as Valerie Berlain notes in her book, while other parts of South Carolina were experiencing growth, a renaissance, an economic uptick, this part of South Carolina, their economy remained stagnant, opportunities withering away, to the point where the only people really making money in that town were the lawyers, like the Murdaughs. Though, of course, they didn't do it alone. They had help. Snakes often nest inside kudzu. The vines create these little pockets for snakes to grow and hide, and they rest there until they're ready to strike. And that, too, was like the Murdaugh family, where they created a whole world, an ecosystem that seemed completely natural to everyone from the outside. But inside each pocket of the Murdaugh family, there were snakes, coiled, ready to strike. If anyone outside of that Murdaugh circle got too close. But why the Murdaughs? There are plenty of greedy lawyers out there in the world. What made the Murdaughs stand out was they were really truly willing to do anything for money. From the very beginning, the Murdaughs were willing to kill for money, even if it meant killing themselves. It was summer in the Low Country, 1940. As always, it was sweltering hot. Even after the sun went down, it was still hotter than Hades. And yet Randolph Sr. sat in his car, likely a Ford sedan, and he waited in the sweltering night, car windows open. The only hope for a breeze was a freight train due to pass by this part of the county any minute now. Randolph knew the train schedule. He knew just about everything there was to know about the trains that passed through this district. He lived by these trains, earning commission from the various lawsuits he filed against one of the largest Southern rail companies. Cases that rarely went to trial because they knew it was better and cheaper to settle than try and fight a lawsuit, especially on Murdoch's turf. Just like his future offspring, Randolph Murdoch was afforded a double life. His day job was as the area's main prosecutor, deciding which cases made it to trial and which cases were dropped. He was also a personal injury attorney with his own private practice. It was undoubtedly a problematic conflict of interest. But back then, at least in the Murdoch family's cases, it was allowed, even encouraged. In many of these cases that were filed against the railroad, they were legitimate. Railroad work was dangerous work. But Murdoch would hedge his bets by finding a jury, manipulating a jury, that would be most sympathetic to his clients. But the Great Depression, which still lingered in 1940, it hurt the legal business. There were fewer jobs, fewer businesses, fewer opportunities for bad things to happen, and there were fewer people willing to pay a lawyer to find out. Reflecting back on his life, there was, at least in the beginning, when Randolph started working as a prosecutor in that district that he believed he himself would be a good, honest man. A man who would serve the people and get justice for others fairly and impartially. But at a certain point, he needed money. And he was willing to take bribes and tamper with cases to ensure the outcome, whether he was prosecutor or personal attorney. It paid to have it all work out in his favor. But there was one part of his life where he could neither cheat nor bribe, and that was his health, his own mortality. At 53 years old, it was as if Randolph's own body had turned against him. Whatever heart he had, it was giving him trouble. And Randolph was in and out of hospitals to treat a life-threatening kidney issue. This was the time before dialysis, certainly before kidney transplants. And so what was going to happen to Randolph was he was going to die a slow, terrible, and painful death from renal failure. And once he was dead, he'd be remembered as a whole other kind of failure. By the time he was 53, he didn't have much money. He had land, but so what? Everybody had land in the low country. It wasn't worth much. And along with that sickly body, there was his wounded pride. Everybody thought he was a big success. All those years of hard work. And when he was gone, they'd discover he was a disgrace. Or maybe there was another solution. He'd spent most of his life taking control of the fate of other people. Why not try it on himself? Randolph decided he could find a way to ensure his death would serve a greater purpose, to have true meaning, and perpetuate his enduring legacy. It involved waiting for that late-night freight train. Sometime after midnight, Randolph heard it. First, he could only hear the faint rumble, then a low, ominous hum. Then he saw the glowing bright light, the one on the front of the locomotive. That light was brighter than any star or anything else in the dense darkness of that country night sky. With the engine of his car running, he watched as the train drew closer, then closer, then closer. And then, as the train was close enough that Randolph could see the silhouette of the conductor, Randolph pushed down on the gas of his car and roared forward, stopping onto the middle of the track. This was 1940. There were no flashing lights, no warning signs. The conductor saw the car right in the middle of the tracks, but there was nothing he could do. As he stood there, in horror, awaiting this inevitable calamity, he saw something strange inside that car. Moments before the train collided with Randolph's car, the conductor said he saw the man stick his head and his arm outside the window, and he was smiling, and he waved like he was greeting an old friend, happy to see that oncoming train. Seconds later, the train struck the car at full speed, killing him instantly. The death of such a prominent man, well, it begged an investigation. And though the conductor swore he told the truth, he saw him drive onto that track. He saw him wave, even smile. This was Hampton County, and Randolph's death was ruled not a suicide, but an accident. It became the railroad company's fault. Randolph's son, that's Randolph Jr., who was Buster number one. He was now a young lawyer himself. And whether Buster knew about this plan or not, everything went the way that Randolph would have wanted it to. Threatened with a wrongful death lawsuit, the railroad company settled a payout of $100,000. That's $2 million in today's money. So this fatal gesture was more or less Buster's inheritance, and it was the foundation, financially and ethically, on which the whole Murdoch dynasty was built. Why die for nothing when you can perpetuate one last fraud and generate one last windfall? When this story was told in the Murdoch family, publicly they would say it was an accident, but privately they would say with a wink and a smile that they were grateful. And in the Murdoch family, it was perversely inspiring. A charming anecdote, part of the family lore. And decades later, in the saga of Alex Murdoch, history nearly repeated itself. Years later, when Alex Murdoch himself would attempt to perpetuate his great-grandfather's legacy, orchestrating his own death as one final scam. Though, of course, in Alex's case, things didn't go according to plan. Now, back in 2005, around the time that Blanca was working for the family. What she knew about the Murdochs was that they were legends. The portraits hanging in the very courthouse that each man served and exploited their entire careers. Those whose misdeeds continued to haunt the town, whether she knew it or not. In the cemetery, where these men were all buried, it was located right across the street from Maggie and Alex's house. She could see it from the window. Whatever Blanca knew about the Murdoch legacy, it was all in the distant past. It was her husband, Mark. He was a local who knew enough to warn Blanca. You can work for the Murdochs. Be friendly with them. You can get close, but not too close. But Blanca couldn't help but get close. Alex was always friendly and respectful. When he introduced her to guests who came to the house, he referred to her not as their housekeeper, but as a friend who was helping Maggie. And Maggie, she was especially generous, eventually referring to Blanca with a little nickname, Chickadee. And the family appreciated her. She was a great cook, and she paid special attention to something that really mattered in the Murdoch family: the way she did the laundry. The laundry room at the Murdoch house, it was known as Blanca's office. It was her headquarters. It was where she went first thing in the morning and the place she headed to the last thing before she left. If anyone in the house ever needed to find Blanca, the best place to start looking was the laundry room. Coming from the Navy, Blanca was impeccable in getting things clean. She even had a special formula, a blend of detergent and fabric softener that became the signature scent of the Murdoch family. Alex, in particular, was very meticulous with his clothing. And most memorable were the polo shirts. He liked his polo shirts on wire hangers, with the collar up and only the top button buttoned. He was also obsessive about his sheets. Perhaps utilizing Blanca's military background, he liked his sheets wrinkle-free and stretched so tight you could bounce a quarter off of them. But there was one area, one part of his wardrobe, that Alex often overlooked: the contents of his pockets. He always seemed to forget things in his pockets. And more than once, when Blanca went through his pockets as she did the laundry, she'd discover little baggies filled with pills. Alex Murdoch's use of pills, it was a family's open secret. Everyone in the house would sooner or later come across Alex's pills. Ever since he started taking them around 2004, after he underwent knee surgery and was prescribed these pills initially for the pain. And, like many, he would come to rely on those pills, and he developed an addiction. And his misuse of opioids, it affected the entire family, especially his youngest son, Paul, who, as a curious little boy, had a certain knack for finding his father's pills. So much so that the family gave him a nickname, the Little Detective. As a kid who apparently had behavioral issues from the beginning, turning the search for your father's drugs into a game probably didn't help Paul as he developed into a young man. And it seems around age 12 or 13, Paul developed a can't beat 'em, join 'em mentality. He wasn't necessarily popping pills, but it was around that age, 13, that Paul started drinking heavily. And it was his heavy drinking and the aggressive personality that emerged. The personality that was so toxic, it had its own nickname, Timmy. And when Paul became drunk Timmy, he was dangerous. It was only a matter of time before Paul's reckless and violent behavior would have deadly consequences. In 2015, after working for the Murdochs for roughly 10 years, Blanca suffered a stroke. And over the next few years, Blanca left the family as she tried to regain her health. Then in 2019, she saw the shocking news. The death of a young woman named Mallory Beach, who was killed in a boating accident. In this fatal boating accident, it was allegedly caused by a very drunk 19-year-old Paul Murdoch. Blanca's reaction to the news, surprisingly, was compassion. She felt sorry for the family that she'd come to love. And she felt particularly sorry for Maggie. The apparent actions of her troubled son had made her an outcast in a community that she thought welcomed her. Everywhere she went, she could feel people talking about her, that she was a terrible mother. And maybe Maggie wondered if they were right. Maggie confided to Blanca for years she hadn't known what to do with Paul, and that she worried about him and what would happen to him. And now finally, the worst thing has happened, or at least she thought at the time. And early on with the boating accident, Maggie would tell Blanca how she did and said things she would later regret, feeling deep shame for instinctively rushing to protect her son instead of extending sympathy to the victims. Blanca believed one of the reasons why Paul was drinking so much was he'd suffered a huge loss. The death of Gloria Satterfield, the family's full-time housekeeper, who'd been there for years before Blanca, and who Paul considered a second mother. Gloria died in 2018 after a tragic accident when she slipped on some stairs at the Murdoch's house and sustained an injury that was serious enough that Gloria went into a coma. She was comatose for 3 weeks until she passed away. And Blanca remembered thinking how wonderful it was that Alex Murdoch was going to help Gloria's 2 sons, that he was going to find a way that they'd be taken care of financially for the rest of their lives. Never realizing, until much later, that this was yet another scam perpetrated by Alex Murdoch, essentially securing her sons a multi-million-dollar settlement that he would keep for himself. At the time, what Blanca saw in 2019 was a family in crisis and they needed help. So Blanca offered to come back, help the family through this difficult time. By the summer of 2021, the whole Murdoch family appeared to be falling apart. There was Paul, who was awaiting trial, in this case with Mallory Beach. There was older brother Buster, who had gotten himself in some kind of trouble at school and gotten kicked out. There was Alex, floundering in his addiction, drowning in lies. Then there was Alex's father, Randolph III, who was dying from cancer and only had days to live. And then there was Maggie. suddenly coming to the realization that her husband was not the man she thought he was, nor was the money she thought they had. Maggie knew Alex was no saint. He continued the generations of tradition in the Murdoch family of the men cheating on their wives. And so over the years, Maggie found a way to self-soothe with cocktails and parties, Louis Vuitton bags, and decorating beach houses. Until this boat accident, it brought everything to the surface. Making it all worse was Maggie was forced to be on the giant family farm, a place she didn't even like, a vast property the size of 2 Central Parks. To Maggie, it felt creepy and lonely. But Alex insisted they buy it, selling their home in Hampton in town to be able to afford this vast property, a property the Murdoch family had wanted for generations. She wanted nothing to do with fishing or hunting or riding around on all-terrain vehicles. She was a mint julep on the porch kind of Southerner. And this was moonshine country. She preferred to spend her time at the beach house. But that summer in 2021, June 7th, Alex called and insisted she come to the farm property. She and Paul needed to be there. Alex's father was dying, and he wanted the family to be together. Thank God Maggie had her 2 trusty companions. There was Blanca, of course, and there was Bubba. Her Bubba, he was a good boy. He was born that way, with soft, lush golden fur, gleaming white teeth, 4 giant feet, and a tail that swung as hard as a hammer. He was a golden retriever, the perfect family dog, but he really belonged to the woman of the house. It was Maggie who named him. She called him Bubbalicious. And Bubbalicious was as sweet and bubbly as the gum he was named after. The family had other dogs, many dogs, some for hunting, and they lived outside, and they were fed once a day. They were kept hungry, so they would be useful. But Bubba, he went with Maggie just about everywhere. From the family's vast farm property to her beloved beach house. And if Maggie was driving, whether it be a car or a golf cart, it was Bubba, her best friend, perched in the passenger seat. This included Blanca, who would have to take the back seat to Bubba. Bubba wouldn't know it, but he too was part of a long legacy, not unlike the Murdoch clan, a breed that originated in Scotland, raised as a working companion for hunters, given the name retriever for the breed's specific skill of being able to retrieve fragile game, like birds, their mouths gentle and round, so the retrievers can carry the hunted animal without destroying it. Bubba was not one of Murdoch's official hunting dogs. Those dogs were kept in caged kennels outside. The Murdochs believed keeping these dogs hungry, feeding them once a day, made for better hunting dogs. But Bubba was anything but underfed. At 104 pounds, he enjoyed regular meals and frequent treats. And Bubba's most retrieved bird was an adorable stuffed replica of the real thing, a stuffed toy in the shape of a chicken. But that night, in June of 2021, something got into the sweet retriever. He was outside with Maggie and Paul and Alex. And maybe he was inspired by all of the hardened hunting dogs in their kennels. But that night, something came over Bubba, and he didn't want to retrieve a toy. He wanted the real thing. That night, while the humans were distracted by other dogs, including a young dog Paul was taking care of, shooting video to send to his friend, Bubba ran off somewhere and came back with a bird in his mouth, a real one. And the humans, they shrieked and yelled for Bubba to drop it. Drop it. The command was likely in Bubba's dog vocabulary. Golden retrievers are considered super dogs who can learn hundreds of words and phrases and connect actions with words and meaning. Bubba, even as a pampered house dog, he probably knew a lot of words. Sit, stay, leave it, and of course, good boy. But sometime that evening, Bubba would see and hear things he hadn't seen or heard before. Sounds of human chaos that didn't make sense. Yelling that sounded like orders and commands, but were really cries for help. As a retriever, Bubba knew humans hunted other animals, but Bubba didn't know they hunted other humans, members of their own family. But that night, Bubba saw, as the adult male, the father, hunted down his own family, using one gun to shoot his son and grabbing another gun to shoot his wife, Maggie, Bubba's best friend. As smart as he was, Bubba was still a dog. He couldn't say what happened, but it appears he tried. When Alex called 911, feigning that someone had come in and shot his family, much to his surprise, it's Bubba that could be heard barking in the background. When the police arrived on the scene, milling about, trying to make sense of what happened, going in all of the wrong directions, Bubba was in one of the kennel cages, a place he didn't belong, trying to get someone to notice. Nothing was right, and the killer they were all looking for, he was right there. It was Blanca who would be the one to notice that Bubba, he was in the wrong kennel. That wasn't where he belonged. And she noticed there were things in the laundry room, her command center, that were off, including Blanca noticing that someone had laid out what appeared to be Maggie's pajamas and her underwear. Blanca knowing, of course, that was not what Maggie wore to bed. And there were other details that were off, things that were so small and subtle, when she mentioned them to police, they didn't really think it was important. But there was one detail that Blanca didn't mention, but that one smart detective picked up on. The night that the bodies were found and Alex was being questioned, one of the detectives noticed that Alex's shirt, it had an interesting smell, a strong scent of fresh laundry. And that was strange, because Alex, he claimed he had just come home from somewhere, that he'd discovered his wife and his son dead on the ground, and he frantically called the police. And no, he hadn't changed his clothes. But the smell of that fresh laundry, Blanca's special blend, it would be the one early clue that would give him away. And weeks later, when authorities unlocked Paul's phone, it was Bubba who would provide the evidence that would crack this case. As you likely know, Alex Murdaugh, he claimed he wasn't anywhere near that farm when the shooting happened, but the video that Paul shot, it captured Bubba's antics, the running and grabbing of that bird, and amidst all the chaos of people's voices, all the shouting, there's one voice that can be distinctly heard, the voice of Alex Murdaugh. Alex Murdaugh's guilt, it couldn't be denied once he had to confront the finality of life as he knew it, the murders of his wife and son, and the inescapable consequences for years of fraud and stealing from his clients, and the public humiliation of his financial ruin. He was going to follow the playbook of his great-grandfather and stage his own death, so his only remaining son, Buster, could inherit a multi-million-dollar insurance payout. And Buster, well, he could continue the family's legal legacy, allegedly hiring a hitman to kill him, to make it look like he too had been murdered the same way his son and wife had been murdered. But, well, his plan, it didn't work. And eventually, as authorities put all the pieces together, Alex was arrested and stood trial and was convicted of murdering his wife Maggie and their son Paul. Even as all these bits and pieces added up, Blanca didn't want to believe her boss, Mr. Alex, that he was the killer. And in fact, when he asked her to clean the house before guests came over, soon after Maggie and Paul were killed, Blanca, she went and did it, not realizing what she thought she was doing to help, essentially made her an accomplice, potentially destroying evidence in the house that might have been useful. In due time, Blanca would become a great asset, testifying during Alex Murdaugh's trial and ensuring Maggie and Paul got justice. Alex will die in prison, but these tragic events, they left a lot of loose ends. And one of the saddest loose ends was Bubba. By the time Alex was convicted, Bubba, he was an old, blind dog. He had a lot of health issues and a lot of trauma from what he witnessed that night. The Murdaugh family's sole survivor, Buster, he couldn't manage. Bubba had nowhere to go. Who wanted to take in an old, sick dog of the twisted Murdaugh family? And with everything that dog went through, wouldn't it be the merciful thing to put old Bubba down? It was really the only choice. Where else was he going to go? Blanca, she didn't owe Alex Murdaugh anything. But in memory of Maggie and Paul, she took Bubba in. And even though Bubba, he's blind and he's old, Blanca still brings him to the cemetery, where he can visit Maggie and Paul, who were buried side by side. And on a sunny day, he likes to lie between the headstones, feeling the warmth of the sun on the grass. And Bubba, he'll sit, he'll lie down, he'll stay, because he's a good boy. A golden retriever who can maybe retrieve the only thing that's left of the Murdoch family. Memories. Thank you for listening to another episode. As always, there's much more to this story. And I encourage you to check out the links in the show notes. Until next time, nighty-night.